Story 1. Glorious. There were still computers with minimal social media. Cameras on phones had a resolution of 2 megapixels, and there was nowhere to send the pictures you took. Glorious. Story 2. Honestly, it was a lot of fun. Most of us didn't really have cell phones, certainly no smartphones, and our parents couldn't reach us all the time or track our locations. We could also do silly things without worrying about going viral on the internet. Story 3. I miss sitting around at lunch with my Discman and burnt CD. The internet had not fully developed as it is now, but there were communities on LiveJournal that were incredible to be part of. Things were not as simple as the 1980s and 1990s, but emerging technology was exciting. We were cautious about our online activities. Not so much at house parties. Clubbing and partying with friends, being in the moment, and taking the occasional photo with our cameras was amazing. Story 4. Social media and phones were still in their early stages, so it felt like we lived in the moment. I am not sure if it is the same now. Story 5. Teenager from the early 2000s here. Baggy clothes were trendy. I used to buy 2XL and 3XL t-shirts and hoodies, even though I was 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 150 pounds. Most people didn't know much about the internet or computers. You were seen as a genius or a nerd if you knew basic things. Music was interesting. Korn was huge, and Cash Money and Eminem were dominating rap music. Will Smith was the biggest actor for a while. People used excessive amounts of hair gel. Tom Green introduced the world to trolling. MTV and BET were significant, while VH1 mainly played old music videos. South Park was actually still funny. Story 6. When I was a freshman, there was a senior who wore a shirt that said, "Let's get one thing straight. I'm not." The entire school talked about it for weeks. People wore sun visors backward and upside down. It was strange watching the drastic shift in politics, particularly after September 11th. I knew people whose friends, just out of high school, went to Afghanistan and then Iraq. I had a few friends stage walkouts when we invaded Iraq, then hold protests by dousing themselves in fake blood and lying by the flagpole at school. It is also difficult to express the odd ways teenagers were similar back then to how they are now, if teens today had just not had phones. This is not a public service announcement against phones for kids, but boredom and how we dealt with it were much different. Story 7. Genuinely cool. It feels like when Andy said, "I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." Story 8. In my early 20s at the time, I reflected on the period. Napster, Kazaa, and other download programs were significant. It was the first time people were able to download movies and music. Downloaded MP3 files were added to your iPod. If you didn't have an iPod, you used one of those MP3 players from brands like Creative, iRiver, and SanDisk. The anime fansub community grew rapidly due to downloader applications, although most of the content was poor quality. More anime began to appear on regular television. PlayStation 2 was the best console system along with Xbox and GameCube. Gaming was incredibly enjoyable back then. I played Game Boy Advance on public transit, and later it was the PSP. Gaming was truly exceptional during that time. The internet was something primarily used at home. Outside, you were disconnected. There were many raunchy sex comedies in theaters. Late-stage alternative metal and rock were popular on the radio, along with late-stage pop music that attempted to be more mature. It seemed we had quickly forgotten about the events of September 11th until it was brought back into focus. What we now call early 2000s hip-hop clothing style is quite similar to what we wore back then. There were horrendous CGI effects in nearly every movie, except for The Lord of the Rings, which were highly anticipated films for 3 consecutive years, along with the Harry Potter series. Japanese horror and extreme action films gained popularity among the art house crowd and DVD enthusiasts. Netflix emerged as the new trend while Blockbuster was slowly fading away. Star Wars remained beloved by fans. Adult Swim was essential viewing every weekend night, preferably with friends and drinks. Friends were deployed overseas and some did not return. Story 9. 56 kilobit internet, chat rooms, bad bleached hair, music videos on MTV or Fuse before school. Not everyone had cell phones, But those who did often used prepaid track phones, Nextel chirpers, or fancy razor flip phones. If you didn't have a cell phone, people had to catch you at home using payphones in public. Many carried a large collection of CDs in their cars, and CD player faceplates were frequently stolen. Story 10. Phones enhance social life without taking over everything. There is no need to worry about cameras or microphones being everywhere, or the possibility of being canceled. Story 11. We had emerging technology before large businesses and government got involved. It was truly the Wild West and absolutely incredible. Today's youth face significant challenges. Story 12. Everything felt like it was in the moment, and time didn't seem to move as fast. We weren't all plugged in and constantly online. You could have a disagreement with someone and resolve it, but now when kids argue, they get embarrassed because everyone is recording, and it often turns into ongoing feuds. There's a reason people say things were better in the past, and in many ways they were. Yes, we have much more now, but was it worth the cost? Story 13. I remember being in places without a phone and having to actually meet at certain times at a specific location. I got a mobile phone in 2006 when I was 16, but it was just that, a mobile phone. Nothing else, really. I used to work on projects with my dad a lot. I would order parts from paper catalogs, and shipping always felt like it took forever. Prime shipping has spoiled us all. I was pretty internet savvy as a teenager, so I would often try to find answers to questions online. It often required a significant amount of effort to find answers for something specific compared to today. Researching information on the internet is much easier today due to faster access and the ability to cross-reference more sources for better solutions. It's awesome. I made regular phone calls using full numbers and such. Story 14. Invincible, there was much less fear and anxiety. Additionally, there was significantly more creativity and an inventive spirit. Story 15. The golden age of video games includes titles like Halo, Call of Duty, BioShock, Grand Theft Auto 4, and Fallout. I enjoyed listening to musicians for their entire albums, not just their hit singles. I recall fighting over the internet or the phone. We couldn't have both. I still remember the notification sounds of MSN Messenger. I was apprehensive about sending that 30-cent text message to my crush because it was considered expensive. The defining aspect of my experience was living in an age of discovery. Finding the next best hilarious clip on YouTube, exploring thousands of albums and bands on iTunes, trying out new sports in high school, attending first parties, and experiencing drinking for the first time. It felt like a time of experiencing life at a raw, wild level, without fear of the forever consequences that children today seem to worry about, such as smartphones, cyberbullying, and social media in general. Story 16. Much better than now, I believe, even though experiences vary depending on the particular situation. It was a time of wonders and progress. Story 17. I listened to a lot of Tattoo, AFI, and Evanescence. MySpace was just starting to gain traction, but online chat rooms were still the main way to meet new people. The first question in any room was always, age, sex, location? And yes, there were plenty of creeps. I can still hear my mom yelling at me to get off the computer so she could use the phone. The joys of dial-up internet. It was also the time I transitioned from male to female as a youth. Aside from the extreme lack of transgender resources and complete disregard from nonprofits, it was a much simpler time. Many of us were still processing the events of September 11th and watched as America thrust itself into war. Story 18. No social media, no smartphones, and Trump was a reality show figure at most. Not everything that happened was intensely politicized. We didn't know how good we had it, but I'm grateful now. Story 19. I turned 15 in 2000. I was the biggest Korn fan. Woodstock 99 had just happened. September 11th was about to happen. My friends and I spent a lot more time together because the internet was still relatively new and smartphones weren't a thing. There was no Facebook and no YouTube. We attended many house parties and field parties, and most of those memories just live in our heads, not immortalized on the internet. It was such a better time. Story 20. Burning CDs, chatting online, and waiting for a song to download on LimeWire. Being a teenager in the early 2000s was a mix of dial-up frustration and pure freedom. We had to make plans instead of just texting at the last minute. Story 21. I was a teenager back then, and I look back on that time fondly, but I am sure a lot of it is just nostalgia and longing to be that young again. So I'll provide a bit of a devil's advocate opinion compared to all the life was so amazing back then comments. The early 2000s were scary because the September 11th attacks had just occurred, we were going into a war, and, to be honest, things never really got back to normal after that day. If you were gay or lesbian, you most likely were in the closet, and LGBTQ+ individuals were the constant butt of jokes in movies and television shows. Legalizing same-sex marriage was completely out of the question, even for many liberal politicians. Everything uncool was labeled as gay, and derogatory terms were thrown around by teenagers frequently. And forget about any support, sympathy, or rights for transgender, non-binary, or other LGBTQ+ individuals. Many adults today say that kids spend too much time on their phones, which is true for all ages. Yet plenty of teenagers back then spent all evening on AOL Instant Messenger watching cable television or playing video games. We just didn't have that technology in our pockets, but I knew many kids who would spend 4 to 5 hours a night in front of a screen after school. The body type expectations for teenage girls were completely ridiculous. All these stars and celebrities were extremely thin. There was no concept of love your body for who you are, or plus-sized models. Watch any movie from the late 1990s to early 2000s, and the people they labeled as fat or chubby were of normal body size. Anyone but a white male running for president was completely out of the question. So the bottom line is that things weren't all sunshine and roses like everyone wants you to believe. Every generation thinks their time growing up was better than today. When I was a teenager in the early 2000s, I'm sure all the adults who were teenagers in the 1980s would say how much better their time was and that the youth of the early 2000s have it so easy. Story 22. Better than now, you may have a mobile phone but no cameras and no social media distractions. You still knew all your friends' phone numbers by heart. Story 23. It was great. I feel concerned for the youth of today. Music is not the same. No one watches the same television shows and shares experiences at school. We didn't carry computers in our pockets all the time. We had to be home when the streetlights came on. Many kids today are suffering from depression and anxiety. I believed I was impressive when I was 15. I wasn't, but that belief felt significant at the time. Story 24. I graduated high school in 2007, which was a significant time in my life. I loved the 2000s as a teenager. The events of September 11th, 2001 had a profound impact on the world, but as a teenager, I didn't dwell on it for long. The internet began to take off around the time I entered high school, although it still felt wild and untamed. Social media was either non-existent or quite different and less invasive than it is today. My circle of friends felt closer back then, and life seemed much simpler. While some of this perception comes from growing into adulthood, the 2000s were an exciting time to be a teenager, in my opinion. Story 25. Overall, life was much more laid back, minus the war events. Phones were just phones. Kids still hung out in neighborhoods or mall parking lots. There were no Instagram feeds to maintain. You took pictures with a digital camera. You had to be in front of the TV at a certain time because there was no digital video recorder. Story 26. I'm into hot topics. I'm a jock now. I'm pretentious as well. I smoke marijuana now. 20 years later, it's cringeworthy to think about, but it was kind of fun at the time. It's this strange experience called growing up. Story 27. Awesome. There were more positive aspects and fewer negative influences. The complainers were still being bullied back then, so nobody had to listen to them. It was a blissful time. Story 28. I was 14 in 2003, just starting my freshman year. All my friends and I were skating, doing stunts, smoking large amounts of cannabis, and running around our small town. We had sleepovers on weekends, playing NFL Madden until 4 in the morning while drinking energy drinks. We rode bikes everywhere and came home when it got dark. There was no social media yet, and life was simple. Story 29. No phones, no tracking, we used disposable cameras. We actually talked to each other, played games, and had to call people we liked, knowing their parents might answer the phone. We would use caller ID blocking to hide our location when calling them from a party or somewhere we were not supposed to be. Story 30. I spent my teenage years in the mid to late 1990s, which were very carefree. While many people look back at their younger years and feel a similar vibe, the world was definitely different then. You could easily disconnect from everything, which is almost impossible to do now. Story 31. Online interactions were more anonymous and less commercial than they are today. That aspect was simpler, but at the time it didn't feel that way. We had just entered a new millennium, and all the technology was new and exciting. Mobile phones with changeable covers, flip phones, polyphonic ringtones, and camera phones were emerging. The internet and mobile phones were becoming widespread and no longer just middle-class luxuries. I believe there was a better balance between online and real-life interactions. On the downside, I would say it was quite a conformist era. There was significant pressure to fit in with what everyone else deemed cool, and after the Y2K futuristic trend faded, fashion lost its fun and quirky edge. That's not to say I disliked the fashion, but enjoyment was no longer a factor. Story 32. In 2000, the Disney Channel was fantastic. Featured shows like The Famous Jet Jackson, In a Heartbeat, and So Weird. Before that, Disney had to go through some changes. After September 11th, everything became quite patriotic. Some of my classmates got married right after high school because their boyfriends were being deployed. Story 33. Using the computer felt like a chore. Once you were done, the internet was disconnected. You had no idea what was happening in the world or what others were discussing. You simply went outside and played in the neighborhood. Story 34. To me, pop culture felt more contained and comprehensible. You could be basic and into mainstream material, or you could be a bit alternative and enjoy underground content, which required a significant amount of dedication to hunt down rare CDs and DVDs, but still felt somehow finite. That was it, those were your choices. Now, I imagine being a teenager feels like facing a supernova of subcultures that are ultra-fluid and ever-changing. That's an oversimplification, but that's how I think it felt then compared to now. Come to think of it, this is what every older person has always said once they no longer understand the youth of today. Story 35. The internet was much slower. You had to connect online. It wasn't just at your fingertips. It was slow, so you had to actually care about what you were looking up. Electronics and clothing were of high quality. Cars were affordable and easy to repair. Jobs were simple to find. People were not as troublesome. Story 36. To be honest, it is probably not that different from what teenagers feel today. It only feels different in retrospect. We went through the same emotions, highs and lows, and challenges that teens likely experience today. Circumstances change, but people generally do not. Story 37. I was a child, but I remember frosted tips and the ramen noodle hairstyle being popular. The teenagers I was around also talked a lot about music videos and similar topics. Story 38. Life was okay, but I also wasn't a taxpayer at that point, so life before then is somewhat irrelevant. Story 39. Really incredible. Access to the internet, games, and chatting with your friends was so much simpler then. We played outside a lot. In my region, we played games like tag, hide and seek, and a very politically incorrect game named Spotlight. We also rode around on bikes and scooters in large groups. We took strange pictures and videos with our friends that nobody ever saw, and sadly, I don't have most of them anymore, so we'll never see them again. Music was angsty, bratty, and fun. Grinding was our only real form of dancing, and it was just as strange as it looks. We played absurd pranks on each other and our parents, and it was laid back. Viral videos were quirky and strange, such as Candy Mountain or Salad Fingers. Music television owned our TVs, and the reality shows back then were outrageous. Look up Room Raiders or Next. Music videos and Total Request Live were legitimate, though. Being a troublemaker was acceptable. We basically trolled our local hangouts, but in a fun way. You never really got into serious trouble. We all knew each other's families very well from growing up with house phones. There were some downsides, but I feel like most of those also exist today while the good times don't. Story 40. The best part was there was no evidence of anything I may or may not have done. unless someone had a wind-up style disposable camera, but the film never developed properly. If someone did have a mobile phone, it was a flip phone with no camera. Story 41. Pager, prepaid cell phone, digital camera, dial-up sounds, and instant messaging. Having my own phone line with an answering machine to record songs before the beep. I still watched VHS tapes and used a rewinder. I had some burned CDs mixed with specially printed or handwritten labels. I took the bus to the mall and loitered frequently. Story 42. As a freshman and sophomore, I felt embarrassed because I still wore briefs and was one of the only ones using a non-Axe deodorant. What I miss most is lunch and the cafeteria food. I mostly ate chili cheese fries and a Dr. Pepper every day. The $1 hot fries and a $1 Arizona tea were always my snacks. I also enjoyed 3 tacos for $1 at Del Taco, right across from the school. Story 43. The internet was very limited. You would call your friend's home phone, and often their parent would answer, so you would have to ask for the child. Story 44. Being an alternative teenage girl in the early 2000s for me was all about rock band t-shirts, studded belts, striped arm warmers, and either baggy pants or a plaid skirt with Converse shoes. I spent hours on MySpace, creating mix CDs with bands like My Chemical Romance, AFI, and The Used. I wrote angsty poetry, hung out at the mall, and watched Donnie Darko countless times, along with attending the Warped Tour. Story 45. You know that Fall Out Boy song, I Don't Care? There's the line, the best of us can find happiness in misery. Being a teenager from that time feels like it just kept looping the high note, and it hasn't stopped for 20 years. Story 46. Everyone I knew had a digital camera. Hemp necklaces, frosted tips on guys, and the duck butt hairstyle were popular. Girls had PC hair and side bangs that were very flat ironed. Around 2007, after Rihanna got a side bob, many girls opted for short side bobs. Every girl I knew wore eyeliner when going out. Going to the mall was very popular. Cell phones needed to be charged once a week, and you had to press each key multiple times to text a single letter. From my memory, people with cell phones before 2005 rarely used them unless making a phone call. After that, you could take low-quality pictures with them. Story 47. For boys, it was gelled hair with the front bangs styled upward like a crown. Frosted tips if you had cool parents. Bathtub plug chain necklaces were also popular before puka shell necklaces came on the scene and stole the show. Story 48. It was wild because of the unknown. Watching the internet as we know it today literally be born was amazing. Sharing music online, MySpace, and making international friends without leaving home was incredible. A small library was at our fingertips. Google Earth, and the first time I ever ordered something from the internet while sitting on my couch. It absolutely blew my mind. The internet grew with me, and I grew with it. I can clearly remember being about 11 years old when I saw the World Wide Web for the first time. I was part of the very first graduating class in my district to require a computer science credit to move from middle school to high school. We powered up 30 computers, and that room got very hot by the end of the period. Our first assignment was to search using Netscape, which was the big search engine before Google, for a subject. I can't remember what that subject was. We searched the term, and it took a few minutes, but I vividly remember being in awe when 9 results came back. The first website I ever visited was the Encyclopedia Britannica. This was only 28 years ago. However, as a parent to teenagers today, I can't imagine that my parents had no idea what I was doing. I was chatting with adults posing as peers in chat rooms and giving out personal information about my life, where I lived and went to school, and my friends' names. My friends and I had no idea what we were doing and received no guidance on internet safety. It still surprises me how I didn't end up kidnapped or trafficked, considering the amount of information I willingly shared. I feel fortunate. I think this is why Generation X and Millennials are so careful about monitoring their children's internet usage. We know what we were doing at their ages online, and these days, especially with artificial intelligence becoming accessible to everyone with a smartphone, the internet feels even more dangerous. I was relaxed with my kids on most things. They need to learn somehow, right? But I didn't take chances with the internet. I preached online safety constantly and monitored everything they did until they were 17 and 18 years old. Was it excessive? Maybe. Do I regret it? Not for a second. Story 49. It was incredible. I was fortunate to live near the woods with my twin brother. We were always outside. Story 50. Pop music was awful, but hip-hop was incredible. The early internet was much better as well. Felt innocent, but it's hard to explain. Story 51. It is probably similar to every generation, but it was surreal for me how quickly everything was changing. Home internet went from being a relatively new thing when I was younger to being common as a teenager. No one had cell phones in middle school, but everyone had them by college. I remember travel before September 11th when my parents walked me to my gate for a class trip overseas, which was an annual tradition at my school. It's almost like I had two childhoods. Story 52. Fashion was a mix of mundane styles we still see today and outrageous pieces that few would dare to wear. Ignorance was still bliss. People were not easily offended by every little thing. It was before the age when the internet would ruin favorite shows, movies, and artists by dismissing personal preferences. Politics had not yet divided the country or manipulated half the population, leaving the other half consumed by hate. Technology was still evolving in ways that measurably improved our lives each year, not just with minor hardware upgrades and software that detracted from clear thinking. In summary, it was merely acceptable. Could have been better or worse. Story 53. It felt quiet. I didn't realize it at the time, but the internet has made life so loud. You weren't exposed to every problem and every piece of news constantly. You had to seek it out yourself. Story 54. You know what these kids wear nowadays? My exact outfits from those years. Baggy jeans with a baggy graphic t-shirt and my bowl or crop cut hair. Story 55. It was sweet. No social media. No unreasonable expectations. Our parents trusted us and we stayed out all night. Everything was more rewarding and felt worth it because we had to work harder for things. They weren't instant like they are now. Story 56. Graduate in 2004 here. I feel like we grew up in the golden age of technology evolution. Personal computers were just becoming popular when we were born, and they became affordable enough that everyone had one in their homes by the late 1990s. Cell phones went from flip phones without a screen to the basic Nokia brick phones. They were still somewhat of a novelty back then, but teens really started getting phones in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It took some effort to figure out how to work the primary technology at the time. Since smartphones were not common, most of life was lived in the real world instead of the digital one. I really feel for our education system now dealing with smartphone-addicted kids with short attention spans. However, World of Warcraft did come out in 2004 and changed a lot of lives. Story 57. Being a gay teenager felt scary and emotional, but also fun, since social media was on the rise, making it easier to meet other gay guys online and have online relationships. I spent a lot of time in diners with friends, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. We often hung out at the mall, jumping from store to store, visiting friends who were working, and helping them close so they could leave early. It was just a lot of time spent away from home, which seems different from today. I was 15 in 2004, and I definitely feel like it was an amazing time to be a teenager. Story 58. Do you like me? Yes. No. Maybe. Waiting for that note back after the next class was highly nerve-wracking. It was always folded up with some sort of style. Story 59. Even as a broody aspiring goth punk kid, there was a strange sense of optimism and hope. It was clear that things were pretty good and only getting better. Then school shootings, September 11th attacks, the opioid crisis, and many other terrible events occurred. Now we are here, and things did not improve. Story 60. MTV's Total Request Live was a significant event, as was host Carson Daly. Music videos were widely enjoyed, and the teenage dream was to travel to New York and gather in front of MTV studios to appear in the background on television, which I did with a friend. Story 61. We were the last mix of the old age and the technology age. We grew up playing outside, but were the first to embrace the internet. I got my first phone in high school. Story 62. It was honestly pretty fun. I have no doubt that my perception is heavily influenced by the fact that being around 18 is generally an exciting time in life, but I feel like things were a little different back then. Things still felt hopeful. We knew about climate change, but it felt like maybe we could turn things around in time. We didn't have extremists out in the open, especially not in the federal government. You could actually afford to rent a modest one-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage job in most places. I really hope that teenagers today still get to feel some of that hope and excitement, but I imagine it's a bit harder to come by right now. Story 63. I really enjoyed it. I graduated high school in 2007. I remember my preteen years playing on Neopets and making friends in my role-playing forum. In high school, I found a bunch of fellow nerds and we explored Albino Black Sheep, Newgrounds, and Homestar Runner, along with all the long-forgotten Flash animations people would make before YouTube had a plethora of ads. There was a crazy series about vampires and strippers that I cannot remember the name of. We learned to code for our own GeoCities accounts, leaving vague away messages on AOL Instant Messenger. I remember the first time seeing End of the World, the Llama Song, or Badger Badger Badger. It had disturbing content for sure, like salad fingers and happy tree friends. But it also felt so optimistic at the same time. I missed being able to disconnect. The world without smartphones was a much simpler time. I used to find new bands at the library, which was incredible. I read manga for free at Barnes and Noble. I was totally not a broke 14-year-old and didn't read Fruits Basket that way. I enjoyed contra dancing at the senior center. I loved seeing my friend's band play at the Legion Hall. Staying up late to watch Inuyasha and Cowboy Bebop on Adult Swim was a highlight. I would go back just to experience it all again. I'm also very lucky that I'm still friends with all those high school nerds. Story 64. It was great, but there was always something off for me, an underlying worry. I wish people understood anxiety as well as they do now. I might have understood myself better. Aside from that, as a man, it was wonderful. The irony of our increased understanding is that I no longer want to approach women because I am acutely aware of how they might feel. I have become a better person for it, but I feel far less courageous. Story 65. It was an amazing experience. I graduated in 2003, and if you wanted to reach your friends, you had to call their house and talk to their parents. We did a lot of fun things, and none of it ended up on the internet. We communicated with friends through instant messaging and were excited when the notification sounded. We passed notes in class and played football during lunch, not caring about social media because it didn't even exist. Truly the idyllic days. Story 66. Being called gay was used as an insult. Calling someone derogatory names because they were unpleasant was commonplace. The term hardcore was frequently used. The internet took 6 days to load a photo. Everything seemed better. Jobs paid well, rent was non-existent, no one had back problems, no one needed a new right knee, and no one had to get up frequently during the night. Story 67. We went to the mall every weekend but never bought anything. We just hung out. We connected 4 game consoles and had Halo parties. We became really good at Dance Dance Revolution. We talked on the phone to our girlfriends for hours. I paid $5 for an entire pizza or a foot-long sub from a sandwich shop. Parents seemed less uptight about their kids. MySpace was great. The Pokemon show and the Game Boy Color games were fantastic. Story 68. Honestly, it was the best time of my life. Even though I hated it at the time, now looking back, I realize I truly took it for granted. Story 69. Being a teenager in the early 2000s was much better than being a teen now. Specifically because we didn't have smartphones and social media. Being a teen is hard enough without being constantly plugged in. The technology industry has negatively impacted kids. Story 70. It was wonderful. Up-and-coming punk pop bands were playing in small venues, and many dance clubs were vibrant. Groups of friends would regularly meet up, and it was easier to be middle class. Guys would create mixtapes when they liked someone. I was more creative and had more experiences because I hadn't become addicted to a smartphone yet. Now I realize I'm getting older because reflecting on this time makes me feel nostalgic. I miss it so much. It wasn't just about being young. It was simply a fun time. Story 71. Our family got a new computer in late 2002, and after that, my friends and I played an immense amount of Diablo 2. Additionally, it was the early days of the internet, featuring decentralized social media, independent discussion forums, and more. Story 72. We were obsessed with taking pictures on our digital cameras. Kelly green, baby pink, and chocolate brown were the best colors, especially together. We wore Converse in all seasons. MySpace was the place to be. Story 73. Waiting in line with friends for midnight releases created an excitement I haven't felt in a long time. Story 74. It was great and fun. Many of us communicated on America Online during classes through our school computers. After school, a group of us would hang out and walk around the city or spend time at someone else's house just having a good time. Other times, we would go to the mall, a restaurant, watch a movie, or watch people fight each other. Once, my best friend had a fight with a classmate in gym class, and after that, she had an encounter with two random guys in the gym bathroom. High school was quite an experience. Social media was minimal, even though MySpace was popular. Facebook gained traction as we approached graduation. People had cell phones, but they weren't glued to them like they are today. It was common to see people at playgrounds, walking around the city, relaxing and enjoying themselves. I loved the early 2000s. I really felt like I belonged. I was quite sociable and everyone knew who I was in high school. At the time, I was unaware of what it meant to be transgender. But I was a boy with long hair, wore makeup, painted my nails, and had a naturally feminine voice and soft features. Despite being in Texas, I was generally well-liked for being a kind person. Story 75. Hideously sexist, ableist, and homophobic. Extraordinarily toxic for adolescent girls trying to feel comfortable in their skin. Great music, though. Story 76. Massachusetts resident here. My favorite band was The Killers, and everyone made fun of me. I remember upgrading from a portable CD player to a digital audio player around 2005 or 2006. I was a RuneScape addict, and the Boston Red Sox broke the curse. Life was great, aside from the Bush administration. Story 77. Not everything was online or digital. It was a lot of fun tinkering with different types of gadgets. Smartphones had not yet been invented, so all the devices constantly tried to outdo each other with interesting new features. Story 78. I grew up in North England. My friends and I would go to the countryside and camp for 2 days on Fridays. We had to walk 3 to 4 miles to a payphone on Saturday mornings to call our parents and let them know we were okay. Without mobile phones, we spent the weekend camping, cooking our own meals, and drinking lager. Good times. Story 79. Having a camera on your flip phone was exciting, and social media was a great way to connect and interact with friends. The internet wasn't filled with ads and propaganda. However, issues like homophobia and sexism were prevalent. Furthermore, derogatory terms were commonly used, and the word rape was often mentioned. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.